In January of 1943, Errol Flynn walked into a Los Angeles courtroom to be tried on 3 counts of statutory rape. He was facing 25 years in prison. 2 teenage girls, 17-year-old Betty Hansen and 16-year-old Peggy Satterley, had accused him of assaulting them, one on his yacht, one at a party in Bel Air. Flynn was the biggest swashbuckler in Hollywood, the star of Captain Blood and the Adventures of Robin Hood, and for 21 straight days the whole country watched his career hang by a thread. Somewhere in that courthouse, working the concession stand, was a 20-year-old woman named Nora Eddington. She served him lunch during recess. They talked. And less than a year after a jury found him not guilty, Errol Flynn married the woman he'd met at his own rape trial. That marriage is not even the most disturbing one. It's just the second of 3. His first wife was a French actress, 5 years his senior, who married him almost the moment he arrived in Hollywood, in a relationship so violent that friends described actual physical fights between them, not arguments, fights. His third wife stayed married to him until the day he died, even though they hadn't lived together in years, because by the end of his life he was traveling the world with a 15-year-old girl he'd met on a studio lot, and everyone around him, his lawyers, his friends, the press, simply let it happen. The trial acquittal gave America a phrase it still uses without knowing where it came from. In like Flynn, it sounds like a compliment. It was coined to describe a man 2 separate teenage girls had accused, under oath, of rape. He was acquitted. The defense attorney who got him off destroyed both girls' characters on the stand so thoroughly that neither of their names meant anything but scandal for the rest of their lives. Flynn walked out of that courtroom a bigger star than when he walked in. Ticket sales went up, his fan mail tripled. A jury of 9 women decided, in the end, that they simply could not believe the world's most charming man had done what he was accused of doing. This is the story of the 3 women Errol Flynn married, the boy from Tasmania who arrived in Hollywood already broken by an unhappy, sometimes abusive childhood, the courtroom romance that gave America a phrase for sexual conquest, and the final 2 years of his life, spent with a teenager, while his actual wife waited, separated but still married, for the funeral that would finally make her his widow. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Errol Flynn was born into exactly the kind of respectable, intellectual household that should have produced a very different man. He arrived on June 20th, 1909, in Battery Point, a neighborhood of Hobart, Tasmania, at the Queen Alexandra Hospital. His father, Theodore Thompson Flynn, was a serious scientist, a marine biologist and zoologist, who became the first biology professor in Tasmania's history, and would later hold the chair of zoology at Queen's University Belfast. This was not a showman's family. This was not a household built on charm or performance. Theodore Flynn spent his life studying marsupials and sea creatures with the patient rigor of an academic, and he would go on to have a genuinely distinguished scientific career, publishing research that outlived his son's fame in the small circles that still cared about Tasmanian zoology. His mother, born Lily Mary Young, changed her name to Morell shortly after the wedding and came from a family she and her son both described as seafaring people. That detail matters more than it first appears, because the sea would become one of the only steady loves of Errol Flynn's entire life, longer lasting than any marriage, any film role, any friendship. He would eventually own boats obsessively, sail them recklessly, and die trying to sell one. The household, on paper, had everything: respectability, intellect, financial stability. What it did not have, by Errol's own later account, was warmth in the direction that mattered most. In interviews and in his own memoir, Flynn described his mother as a source of both physical and psychological abuse during his childhood, language that shows up plainly in biographical summaries of his life. He rarely elaborated on specifics. He didn't need to. The pattern that followed him for the rest of his life, an inability to stay attached to any one woman for long, a habit of testing every relationship until it broke, started somewhere, and Flynn himself pointed backward toward that house in Tasmania when asked. What is documented without dispute is the trail of expulsions. He was sent to a series of respectable schools, first locally in Hobart, then to a private boarding school in London called South West London College from 1923 to 1925, then back to Australia to attend the Church of England Grammar School in Sydney, where he was, for a time, classmates with a boy named John Gorton who would grow up to become Prime Minister of Australia. Flynn did not grow up to become Prime Minister of anything. He was expelled from school after school for fighting, for insubordination, and, by his own account, for an incident of alleged sexual misbehavior involving the daughter of the school's laundress. He was a teenager already testing the exact boundary that would define the worst chapter of his adult life. By 18, he had given up on formal education entirely and gone looking for something that felt more like his mother's seafaring blood than his father's careful science. He travelled to Papua New Guinea, then one of the most remote and lawless colonial outposts in the world, and spent roughly 5 years there doing work that sounds almost too colourful to be entirely true. He was a plantation overseer, managing tobacco and copra operations that mostly failed. He tried gold prospecting in the hills near what is now Port Moresby. He briefly worked as a cadet patrol officer for the colonial government until it was discovered that he had misrepresented his qualifications to get the job, and he was let go. He described himself, in his memoir My Wicked, Wicked Ways, as having also worked as a slave recruiter and a diamond smuggler during this period, though biographers have never been able to fully confirm how much of his own account of these years was true and how much was Flynn constructing the legend of himself before anyone else had the chance to. One thing from New Guinea followed him for the rest of his life, whether the rest of the stories were true or not: malaria. He contracted it during those years in the tropics, and it would recur throughout his adult life, contributing to chronic health problems that started wearing on him decades before they should have. By 1933, broke, and back in Australia, his luck turned, in the way luck turns for people who have spent years accumulating charisma without quite knowing what to do with it. An Australian film producer named Charles Chauvel had seen photographs of the tall, striking 24-year-old and offered him the lead role of the mutineer Fletcher Christian in a semi-documentary film called In the Wake of the Bounty. Flynn had never acted professionally in his life. He took the part because it paid, and something in the process of standing in front of a camera and being watched by an audience clicked in a way that gold prospecting and tobacco farming never had. He went to England afterward, joined a repertory theatre company in Northampton for several months, picked up small stage roles in Glasgow and London's West End, and eventually caught the attention of a Warner Brothers talent scout named Irving Asher, who cast him in a minor 1934 picture called Murder at Monte Carlo. It went nowhere commercially, but Asher believed in what he'd seen, and he convinced the studio in Hollywood to take a chance on the Tasmanian nobody with no formal training and an already well-earned reputation for trouble. Flynn boarded a ship bound for London that would eventually connect him to Hollywood, and somewhere on that voyage, he met a French actress 5 years older than him, already established, already connected to the right people in the industry he was about to enter. Her name was Lily Demeter. She would become his first wife, and the marriage that followed would be the template, in almost every ugly detail, for the pattern that ran through the rest of his life. Lily Demeter did not fall for Errol Flynn so much as she recognized him. She was a French actress, born Liliane Carré, and by the time she met Flynn on that transatlantic crossing, she was already a genuine star, a veteran of French and German cinema who had worked her way into Hollywood years before Flynn had any prospects at all. She was 5 years older than him, sophisticated in the way that a European film career in the 1920s made a woman sophisticated, and she had a temper that everyone who knew her described using some version of the word ferocious. She saw in Errol Flynn a very specific thing, a beautiful, charismatic, penniless nobody who was about to need exactly the kind of connections she had spent a decade building. She was right about the opportunity. She was catastrophically wrong about the man. Demeter was friendly with Anne Warner, wife of studio boss Jack Warner, and when Flynn arrived in Hollywood in 1934, with Irving Asher's recommendation and almost nothing else, it was Demeter's social access that helped position him. Warner Brothers built a small mythology around their new signing, marketing him as an Irish leading man freshly arrived from the London stage, which was a considerably more polished description than anything close to the truth of a expelled schoolboy who'd been running tobacco plantations in New Guinea 3 years earlier. The studio's gamble paid off faster than anyone expected. In 1935, needing a lead for a pirate adventure called Captain Blood after their first choice, Robert Donat, turned the role down, Warner Brothers gave the part to their untested 26-year-old contract player. Captain Blood was a sensation. Flynn, unknown a year earlier, became an overnight international star, the natural successor to Douglas Fairbanks as Hollywood's swashbuckling leading man. He married Lili Demeter on June 19, 1935, riding the exact wave of his sudden fame. It should have been, on paper, a genuine partnership between two people who understood the industry and each other. It became, almost immediately, one of the more combustible marriages in a town that had no shortage of combustible marriages. Friends and biographers describe the relationship in language that goes well past the usual Hollywood euphemism of tempestuous. There were real physical altercations between them, not metaphorical fireworks but actual fights, screaming matches that spilled into public view, objects thrown, doors broken. Demeter was possessive and controlling, in a way that a newly famous, hard-drinking 20-something Flynn had no interest in accommodating, and Flynn was unfaithful in a way that a proud, established actress like Demeter had no intention of tolerating quietly. The two instincts collided constantly. Through the volatility, Flynn's career kept climbing at a pace that outran almost every other actor of his generation. He made The Charge of the Light Brigade in 1936. He starred opposite a young contract actress named Olivia de Havilland in a string of pictures that would define the era of swashbuckling romance. Captain Blood, then The Charge of the Light Brigade, then most famously, The Adventures of Robin Hood in 1938, which remains the film most people still associate with his name. Flynn and de Havilland had real chemistry on screen, and, by most accounts, real chemistry off it as well, though it apparently went unconsummated, in part because Flynn had a wife waiting at home, however badly that marriage was actually going. He also, during these same years, developed the reputation that would eventually define him more than any role he played. He drank heavily, constantly, in a way that was already becoming a serious problem well before it became the health catastrophe of his final decade. He fought, sometimes literally, in bars and at parties, cultivating a persona built around danger and pleasure that the studio found commercially useful right up until it stopped being useful. And he pursued women with a persistence and volume that became legendary even by the permissive standards of 1930s Hollywood, a town that did not require much of its leading men in the way of fidelity. In 1941, Demeter gave birth to their only child, a son named Sean. Whatever else was breaking down between his parents, Sean Flynn would grow up adored by his father in the particular, complicated way that famous absent fathers adore their children, genuinely, but from a distance, and often through the mediation of other people managing the actual logistics of parenting. By 1942, the marriage had exhausted whatever had once made it functional. Lili Demeter filed for divorce, and it was granted that year, ending a 7-year marriage that had been defined, almost from its opening months, by exactly the volatility that both of them, in their more honest moments, seemed to have expected from the start. The custody battle over Sean that followed was bitter and prolonged, dragging through the courts for years, both parents fighting over a child who would grow up between them and eventually choose a path that took him about as far from both of their worlds as it was possible to go. He became a war photojournalist, covering conflict zones with the same restless disregard for personal safety that had defined his father's adventures in New Guinea, and in 1970 he disappeared in Cambodia while covering the Vietnam War, presumed captured and killed by Khmer Rouge forces. He was declared legally dead in 1984, having never been found. But that tragedy was decades away in 1942. What was directly in front of Errol Flynn, in the same year his marriage to Demeter was ending, was a criminal accusation that would follow him for the rest of his life and reshape how an entire country understood the phrase movie star charm. 2 teenage girls had accused him of rape, and the trial that followed would make him more famous, not less. The complaint that started it all came from a 17-year-old named Betty Hansen, and it very nearly went nowhere. Hansen had come to a party in September of 1942 at a Bel Air home owned by the silent film actress Colleen Moore, a house jointly leased at the time by 3 men, including a former Olympic boxer named Freddie McAvoy. Hansen, an aspiring actress who had arrived at the party with a studio messenger, had been drinking heavily and was sick from it by dinner time. According to the account she gave afterward, Flynn took her upstairs to clean up, and what followed there was the basis of her complaint. She told her sister the next day. A complaint was filed with the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. The DA at the time, reviewing Hansen's complaint, recalled something. A similar accusation had already been made against Flynn and quietly dropped. A girl named Peggy Satterley, a 16-year-old dancer, had claimed that in August of the previous year, Flynn had invited her aboard his yacht, given her alcohol, and raped her there. That earlier complaint had gone nowhere the first time, in part, according to Flynn's own stand-in stuntman Buster Wiles, because Satterley's father had approached Flynn beforehand demanding money, which cast enough doubt on the motive that prosecutors had let it drop. With a second, independent complaint now on file, the newly elected district attorney decided the 2 cases together were strong enough to prosecute. Flynn was indicted in November of 1942 on 3 counts of statutory rape, 1 relating to Hansen, 2 relating to Satterley. Under the law at the time, the girls' actual willingness was legally irrelevant. Both were under the age of consent. If the jury believed the acts happened as described, conviction was close to automatic, and the sentence could have run as high as 25 years. Flynn's response to the initial accusation, when it became public, was almost comically dismissive. Asked about Hansen's claim, he said he had hardly touched her. It was the kind of answer that assumed the charge would simply evaporate under the weight of his own charm, and for a while it looked as though he might be right to assume it. He hired Jerry Giesler, the most successful celebrity defense attorney in Los Angeles, a man who had already made his name a decade earlier defending theater mogul Alexander Pantages against a nearly identical statutory rape charge, and had won by systematically attacking the accuser's sexual history and credibility rather than disputing the physical facts of the case. It was a legal strategy Giesler had essentially pioneered and perfected. You did not have to prove the encounter never happened. You only had to convince a jury that the girl making the claim was not the kind of girl a jury should believe. Giesler ran the same playbook for Flynn, and he ran it with total confidence, because he understood something about the cultural moment that the prosecution seemed not to fully grasp. Errol Flynn was, at that exact point in 1942 and 1943, one of the most beloved men in America, riding the peak of his swashbuckling stardom, and the country was in the middle of a war that badly needed its heroes intact. Giesler built his jury selection around that reality. He wanted as many women on the jury as he could get, correctly betting that Flynn's charisma and reputation would work in his favor, with an audience predisposed to find him charming rather than guilty. He succeeded. 9 women and 3 men sat in the jury box when testimony began. The trial ran from January 11th to February 6th, 1943, and for 21 days it consumed the American press. Crowds of fans packed the courtroom and lined the hallways outside, hoping for a glimpse of him. Giesler's defense strategy worked exactly as designed. He attacked Hansen's and Satterley's morals, their sexual histories, their motives, and their credibility, with a thoroughness that left both girls' reputations in ruins, regardless of the verdict. Whatever had actually happened to them became, by the end of the trial, almost beside the point. The trial had become a referendum on whether two working-class teenage girls were believable enough to take down America's favorite movie star, and the jury's answer, after 24 hours of deliberation, was no. Flynn was acquitted on all 3 counts. He walked out of that courtroom to cheering crowds. His fan mail reportedly tripled in the weeks that followed. Ticket sales for his films went up. A man who had been on trial for raping 2 teenage girls emerged from the experience, more popular than when he went in, and the country, rather than reckoning with what that said about itself, turned the entire episode into a joke. The phrase, "in like Flynn," entered the American vocabulary almost immediately afterward, used as a cheerful shorthand for effortless success with women. Flynn reportedly wanted to title his own memoir, "In Like Me," a joke on the phrase his own trial had created. His publishers talked him out of it, and the book became My Wicked, Wicked Ways instead, which was, if anything, an even more honest title. What almost nobody discussed at the time, and what only becomes visible looking back at the shape of his whole life, is what the trial revealed, rather than what it resolved. A 20-year-old woman working the concession stand at that courthouse had served Flynn his lunch during recess over those 21 days. They had talked. He had noticed her. Her name was Nora Eddington. And less than a year after a jury decided Errol Flynn could not be believed to have done what 2 teenage girls said he did, he married the woman he had met while that same jury was deciding it. Nora Eddington was 19 years old, working a cigarette and snack counter at the Los Angeles County Hall of Justice, when the most famous man on trial in America started coming through her line every day for lunch. Her father, Jack Eddington, was a captain in the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, which meant Nora had grown up adjacent to law enforcement her entire life and would have understood, better than most 19-year-olds, exactly what kind of trial was unfolding in the building where she worked. She served Errol Flynn his food during recess, day after day, for the 21 days his statutory rape trial ran through January and February of 1943. They talked. He was, by every account of people who knew him, at his absolute best in these small, low-stakes moments of charm, and whatever Nora Eddington saw in him during those brief courthouse exchanges was apparently enough to outweigh the fact that the entire reason she was seeing him at all was a rape trial. Flynn was acquitted on February 6, 1943. The romance with Nora developed quickly after that, and it developed under exactly the kind of secrecy that his previous marriage's messy public unraveling had taught him to prefer. By the summer of 1943, Nora was pregnant. The couple eloped to Acapulco, Mexico, in August of that year, where, according to some accounts, her father's own connections through the sheriff's department may have helped smooth the arrangements for a quiet ceremony, far from the Los Angeles press, that had spent the previous winter camped outside his courtroom. He married her, in other words, because she was pregnant, less than 6 months after being acquitted of raping 2 teenagers, having met her while she served him lunch during his own trial. Their daughter Deirdre was born in Mexico City on January 10, 1945. For a period, the marriage genuinely seemed to work better than his first one had. Nora was young, warm, and by most descriptions genuinely fond of him rather than possessive of him in the way Lili Damita had been. She appeared in a small role in Flynn's 1948 film, Adventures of Don Juan. Though her connection to the film industry otherwise remained thin, she was, first and always, Flynn's wife, rather than an actress building her own career. She managed a household that, for a few years, looked from the outside like the domestic life Flynn had never quite managed with Damita. There were 2 daughters now. There were photographs of a happy family. There was, for a while, a version of Errol Flynn that seemed almost settled. It did not last, because nothing in Errol Flynn's adult life lasted once the initial charm of newness wore off. Their second daughter, Rory, was born in March of 1947, and by the time she arrived, according to every biographical account of the marriage, the relationship was already essentially over, in every way that mattered. Flynn's drinking, never really under control at any point in his adult life, had gotten worse rather than better with fame and money and access. His infidelities continued at the same pace they always had. A man who had built his entire public identity around irresistible charm did not stop testing that charm on other women simply because he had a wife and 2 young children at home. And there were, by more than one later account, allegations of abuse within the marriage as it deteriorated, consistent with the same pattern of volatility that had characterized his relationship with Demeter, if perhaps less publicly explosive. Nora filed for divorce, and it was granted in 1949, ending a marriage that had begun with a rushed elopement to Mexico and a pregnancy, and had run its course in almost exactly the 6 years it took their younger daughter to be born and the household to fall apart. Unlike the bitter, drawn-out custody battle Flynn had fought with Demeter over Sean, the divorce from Nora was handled with what both parties later described as relative amicability. Flynn, whatever his failures as a husband, did not fight her for the children the way he had fought his first wife. Nora moved on fast, in the way people sometimes do after finally exhaling out of a marriage that had been suffocating them for years. She married the popular singer Dick Haymes on July 17, 1949, just weeks after her divorce from Flynn was finalized, in a relationship that the gossip columns revealed had actually been developing as an affair well before the Flynn marriage officially ended. That marriage to Haymes would also end in divorce a few years later. She married once more after that, to a man named Richard Black, which also ended in divorce. She would, decades later, write her own memoir about her years with Flynn, called Errol and Me, published in 1960, a year after his death, describing him with the complicated mixture of affection and clear-eyed critique that seems to characterize almost every account left behind by the people who loved him. Charismatic, magnetic, genuinely capable of tenderness, and almost entirely unable to sustain any of it once real life set in around him. She lived until 2001, dying at 77 after a long battle with kidney disease. She had outlived Flynn by more than 4 decades. Her final resting place, at Westwood Village Memorial Park, was beside her son Kevin, a child from a later relationship who had died of leukemia at the age of 10, a private tragedy in a life that the public had only ever noticed because of the 6 years she spent married to a man she met while he was on trial for rape. By 1950, Errol Flynn was single again, 40 years old, his box office appeal fading fast as his drinking caught up with his looks, and he was about to marry for the 3rd and final time, to a woman who would end up bearing his name for the rest of his life, whether or not they were actually living as husband and wife. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Errol Flynn met his 3rd wife the way he'd met almost everyone important in his adult life, on a film set, with a wife or fiancé already in the picture and about to be discarded. Patrice Wymore was 23 years old, a Kansas-born stage and film actress who had grown up touring with a vaudeville family and made her Broadway debut in 1948 before Warner Brothers signed her. She had just finished a singing role opposite Doris Day in Tea for Two when she was cast alongside Flynn, then 40 years old, in a western called Rocky Mountain, shot on location in New Mexico in 1950. Flynn was engaged to someone else at the time. It did not slow him down for long. What he wrote about Wymore afterward, in his own autobiography My Wicked, Wicked Ways, is some of the most self-aware writing he ever produced about any of his relationships, and it reads almost like a confession dressed up as a compliment. He described her as attractive, warm, and wholesome, someone who could sing, who was reserved, who had beauty and dignity. And then he wrote the line that tells you everything. She typified everything I long for, everything I am not. He married her anyway, knowing exactly what that gap meant, the way a man who has spent his whole adult life running from something occasionally marries the thing he's running from just to see what happens. The wedding took place at the Monaco Town Hall in Nice, France, in October of 1950, a small, hastily arranged ceremony that Flynn would later describe with unusual sincerity as wonderful, if only because, in his words, it was nice to have a legitimate wedding for a change. His previous marriage had begun with a secret elopement forced by pregnancy, and the one before that had ended in years of bitter, public custody warfare. This one, for once, was simply a wedding. The early years had real warmth in them. They lived aboard Flynn's yacht for stretches, travelling the way he had always preferred to live, unmoored and restless. They attended parties thrown by Marion Davies and film premieres in Beverly Hills, the fading glow of an era that was itself ending around both of them, since Hollywood in the early 1950s was moving away from swashbuckling adventure pictures and toward the grittier, more cynical films of the coming decade. And Flynn's kind of stardom had no obvious place in what was replacing it. Their daughter, Arnella Roma Flynn, was born on December 25, 1953, Christmas Day. Wymore, who had built a genuinely promising career of her own through the early 1950s, appearing opposite Randolph Scott and in a string of Warner productions, made the decision most of Flynn's wives eventually made. She stepped back from acting to raise their daughter and to try to manage a husband whose health was already, by his mid-40s, in serious and visible decline. That decline was not subtle. Flynn's drinking, which had been a defining feature of his life since his 20s, had by the 1950s become inseparable from serious drug use as well, and the combination was doing exactly what decades of steady abuse does to a body. He looked, by his mid-40s, considerably older than he was. His once reliable box office draw had faded to the point that Warner Brothers terminated his contract in 1950, the same year he married Wymore, ending a 15-year run at the studio that had made him a star. He was reduced to smaller pictures, occasional television work, and long stretches, simply sailing his beloved yacht and burning through what remained of his savings. The family settled, for a time, on a 2,000-acre cattle ranch and coconut plantation in the Blue Mountains of Jamaica, near Port Antonio, a property so associated with Flynn afterward that the area's marina still carries his name. Wymore tried, in the middle of this decline, to build something like an actual home, a working ranch, a business, a daughter growing up in one place, instead of hotel rooms and film sets. It was not enough to hold against what was happening to her husband. Flynn's addictions overwhelmed whatever domestic stability Wymore was trying to construct around him, and at some point in the later 1950s, the couple separated. What makes this marriage different from his first two is what happened next. They never divorced. Whatever had broken down between them personally, neither of them formally ended the legal marriage, and so when Errol Flynn died in October of 1959, Patrice Wymore was still, on paper and in every legal sense, his wife. She became his widow rather than his ex-wife, despite having lived apart from him for the final stretch of his life, despite the fact that in his last months he was living with someone else entirely. Wymore never remarried. She eventually returned to the Jamaica ranch Flynn had left her and spent much of the rest of her long life there, running a boutique and a wicker furniture business, occasionally returning to the stage in summer stock productions, always present at tributes to her late husband's memory. Tragedy would find her again decades later. Her daughter Arnella, who had grown up to become a model in Europe, died of an apparent drug overdose in 1998, a devastating echo of the addictions that had ended her parents' marriage, in every way except the legal one. Patrice Wymore died in Jamaica in March of 2014, at 87, the longest-lived of Errol Flynn's 3 wives, and the only one who never stopped, in some sense, being married to him. But in the final 2 years of his actual life, the woman traveling the world at his side was not his wife at all. She was a teenager he'd met on a studio lot. In October of 1957, on the Warner Brothers studio lot, Errol Flynn met a 15-year-old girl named Beverly Ardland. He was 48. She was working as an extra, a young dancer and actress, whose mother, Florence Ardland, had been pushing her through the Hollywood child performer circuit since she was a small child. 15 years earlier, almost to the year, Flynn had stood trial for statutory rape involving 2 teenage girls, and had been acquitted by a jury, persuaded that a man so charming simply could not have done what he was accused of. He had learned, evidently, nothing from the experience, except that the charm still worked. He pursued Beverly Adland, and by her mother's own later account, the relationship became sexual almost immediately. What makes this chapter of Flynn's life different from everything that came before it is not the age gap alone, since Hollywood in this era tolerated enormous age gaps between powerful men and young women as a matter of routine. What makes it different is that almost nobody stopped it. Florence Adland, rather than protecting her daughter, appears by every account to have actively facilitated the relationship, seeing in Flynn's attention an opportunity for her daughter's career, rather than a serious danger to her daughter's well-being. Florence would later write, or have ghostwritten, a memoir called The Big Love, published in 1961, 2 years after Flynn's death, in which she described the relationship in detail, and, remarkably, in terms that framed it as a kind of Hollywood romance rather than what it plainly was. The book would later become the basis for a one-woman Broadway show, and decades afterward, a film called The Last of Robin Hood, both of which grappled, with varying degrees of honesty, with exactly how disturbing the underlying story actually was. Flynn called her Woodsy, a nickname that stuck for the rest of their time together. He took her out of Los Angeles almost immediately and kept her moving. Jamaica, where his ranch was, Africa, Europe. The relationship existed almost entirely outside the reach of any institution that might have intervened, conducted across international borders with a teenager whose own mother was arranging the travel. He tried, with the same instinct that had made him a movie star 20 years earlier, to build her a career out of the relationship. He pitched the two of them as the leads for Stanley Kubrick's upcoming adaptation of Lolita, a novel about an adult man's obsession with a young girl that would have made the casting a grotesque piece of art, imitating life in the most literal way possible. Kubrick did not cast them. The roles went to James Mason and Sue Lyon instead. Flynn did get one project made with her. He wrote and directed a low-budget film called Cuban Rebel Girls in 1959, shot in post-revolutionary Cuba, casting Beverly in the lead role and himself as a version of his own public persona, playing a war correspondent covering the Castro Revolution. It was rushed, poorly made, and commercially and critically ignored on release. It did nothing for Beverly's career, which never recovered any momentum after Flynn's death, and it stands today mostly as a curiosity, the final film of one of Hollywood's biggest stars, built specifically as a vehicle for a girl who had been a minor when their relationship began. By 1959, Flynn's finances were in genuine collapse. The drinking had by then become almost total. Friends and biographers describe him consuming as much as 2 liters of vodka a day in his final year, alongside whatever other substances were available to him. His body, only 50 years old, had aged in a way that shocked people who saw him in person. He was broke enough that he needed to travel to Vancouver, Canada, that October specifically, to negotiate the sale of his beloved yacht, the Zaka, the one steady love of his adult life, the one connection back to his mother's seafaring family and his own restless years in New Guinea. He needed the money. He brought Beverly Adland with him. She was 17 by then. At the airport in Vancouver, when a journalist asked Flynn directly why he preferred the company of such young women, his answer was, according to the paper that printed a heavily euphemized version of it the next day, blunt to the point of being unprintable in full. They stayed as house guests of a local businessman named George Caldo for most of the week, drinking and socializing at night spots around the city while Flynn negotiated the yacht sale. For several days before the end, Flynn had been complaining of worsening pain in his back and legs and had been largely bedridden. On the afternoon of October 14th, on his way to the airport for a planned departure, he asked his host to find him medical help. What happened over the following hours would end the marriage that was never actually a marriage, the 15-year-old relationship that the world had, for reasons that still look indefensible in hindsight, mostly allowed to happen in plain sight. Errol Flynn died on the afternoon of October 14, 1959, in a Vancouver apartment belonging to a local businessman named George Caldo, 3 hours before he was supposed to fly home. He had spent the previous several days bedridden with worsening pain in his back and legs, a physical collapse his body had been building toward for years. On the way to the airport that afternoon, the pain became bad enough that he asked Caldo to find him a doctor. A physician named Dr. Gould came to the apartment, examined him, and advised him to rest before continuing the journey. Flynn lay down. His condition worsened rapidly. Beverly Adland and Dr. Gould attempted to revive him, first with amyl nitrite, then with a direct injection of adrenaline to the heart. Nothing worked. Emergency crews worked on him for 90 minutes. He never regained consciousness. He was 50 years old. The autopsy that followed, required under Canadian law for any foreign national who dies in the country, revealed the full physical cost of 3 decades of extraordinary excess. The coroner described a body that looked decades older than its actual age, somewhere between 75 and 85 years old by internal condition, ravaged by a lifetime of heavy drinking, drug use, and the recurring malaria he had carried since his 20s in New Guinea. A further examination indicated that even if his heart hadn't failed that afternoon, cirrhosis of the liver would likely have killed him within the year regardless. Errol Flynn's body had been dying for years. His face and his charm had simply kept up appearances long after almost everything underneath had already given out. The 17-year-old girl who had been traveling with him collapsed into hysterics in the apartment, reportedly injuring herself against a balcony railing badly enough that other guests feared she might go over the edge before she was restrained. A newsman later found her wandering nearby, dazed, still in her nightclothes, hours after Flynn's death had been confirmed. What followed was a dispute that has been misremembered for decades as an act of spite. Beverly Adland wanted Flynn buried in Jamaica, at the ranch that had been his home with Patrice Wymore. Patrice Wymore, his actual legal wife, insisted on Los Angeles instead. The popular version of the story ever since has painted this as Wymore's final act of revenge against a husband who had spent his last 2 years openly living with a teenager. The more mundane truth, according to people who later reconstructed the timeline, was largely bureaucratic. Canadian law required an autopsy for any foreign national who died there, and having completed it, the law required the remains to be returned to the deceased's legal residence, which was Los Angeles County. The Los Angeles County Health Department, worried about public health regulations of the era, filed an immediate burial order once the body arrived. Getting a disinterment order to move him to Jamaica afterward would have been close to impossible. There was no available room for a grand gesture of forgiveness or spite. There was only paperwork, moving faster than anyone's grief. He was buried at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California, in a closed casket, within roughly 2 days of his remains arriving from Vancouver. His estate, despite a career that had made him one of the highest-paid actors of his generation, was valued at the time of his death at a mere few £100s. Decades of lavish spending, legal fees from a lifetime of trials and lawsuits, and untreated alcoholism had consumed nearly all of it. Patrice Wymore, his widow in every legal sense despite years of separation, returned eventually to the Jamaica ranch and lived there for the rest of her long life, dying in 2014 at 87. Nora Eddington, his second wife, lived until 2001, dying at 77 after decades spent almost entirely out of the public eye that had once watched her serve him lunch at his own rape trial. Lily Demeter, his first wife, the volatile French star whose Hollywood connections had launched his career and whose marriage had set the template for everything that came after, lived until 1994, outliving her ex-husband by 35 years. Beverly Adland's mother published her memoir of the relationship 2 years after Flynn's death, and Beverly herself drifted through a brief, unsuccessful attempt at a singing and dancing career before marrying twice, divorcing twice, and eventually disappearing from public life almost entirely. She died in 2010, at 67, having spent the final 50 years of her life carrying the distinction of having been the underage girlfriend of one of Hollywood's most notorious men, a distinction she never seems to have fully escaped or wanted to revisit. And Sean Flynn, the only son, born to the marriage that had begun the entire pattern, grew up to inherit his father's exact restlessness and his exact disregard for his own safety, just aimed at something more consequential than yachts and nightclubs. He tried acting first, briefly following in his father's footsteps in a handful of adventure pictures. It didn't hold his interest. He went to Africa to work as a safari guide and big game hunter. Then, in 1966, he picked up a camera and became a war photographer, covering the conflict in Vietnam for major international outlets, chasing danger with the same appetite his father had once chased women and drink. In April of 1970, at 28 years old, Sean Flynn was captured by Khmer Rouge forces in Cambodia while on assignment. He was never seen again. He was declared legally dead in 1984, having simply vanished the way certain kinds of restless men eventually do, chasing something that finally caught up with them. Look at the whole shape of it. A boy from a respectable, intellectual Tasmanian household, raised by a distinguished scientist father and, by his own account, an abusive mother, who spent his adolescence being expelled from one respectable school after another before running off to New Guinea to prospect for gold. A man who arrived in Hollywood already carrying whatever had broken in that childhood, and who spent the rest of his life running the same test on every woman who came near him. Could she survive him? Most of them, in the end, could not. A wife whose volatile marriage nearly matched his own violence. A wife he met at his own rape trial, who bore him 2 daughters before the marriage collapsed under the same drinking and same infidelity that ended every relationship he ever had. A wife who described him, in his own words, as everything he longed for and everything he was not, who stayed legally married to him because the law made leaving inconvenient, and who ended up burying him because the law made that convenient instead. And in his final 2 years, a 15-year-old girl, nobody with the power to stop it, seemed willing to stop, right up until his body finally gave out in a stranger's apartment in a city he was only visiting to sell his boat. Errol Flynn made his name playing heroes, Robin Hood, Captain Blood, men who did the right thing by instinct, effortlessly, the way the camera made everything about him look effortless. The trial gave America a phrase that turned his most serious accusation into a punchline. His own life, examined honestly, offers a much less comfortable phrase in its place. Not every man the camera loves deserves to be believed. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.